Thanks very much. Oh. Thanks very much, Matt, for that kind introduction. What Matt is not telling you is that the conversation was so great that Matt's like, okay, we got to stop talking about this because otherwise I need to make sure I'm going in that direction. And I think we came to a mutual agreement that if it came to a stimulating conversation about politics or driving at 70 miles an hour, make sure you're going the right way, we'll pick the latter. So, my topic for today is remapping the Red Sea, a network-centric theory or approach to Red Sea security. When we tend to think about security in terms of these regions, the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, which, as we'll talk about here in a few minutes, I think there's a direct connection between the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf. As we think about these areas, we tend to default to looking at them through the lens of what I would call geopolitics. And that tendency is found not only in the literature, it is also, I would say, institutionalized in our security apparatus as it currently exists. What I want to suggest today is, and for those who were at my talk last year, you probably remember, I have a tendency to come out with these big concept things, let you guys pick them apart, and then try to write articles on them later based on the feedback that you guys give. So once again, I'm using you guys as guinea pigs for some fray concept. What I want to suggest is not necessarily replacing geopolitics, but rather supplementing it with a more network-centric approach. In other words, looking at some types of network analysis. And I think this is particularly important when we talk about globalization. To look at the security context of the Red Sea in a little bit of a broader framework. So what I'm going to do today is outline the framework, and then I figured as we get into the Q&A, we can talk about how some of these specific security concerns and security issues within the Red Sea might apply to this network-centric analysis. So what's the difference between a geopolitical and a network-centric analysis? Geopolitics, I would say, starts with the old saw that geography is destiny. In other words, the primary factor that is going to shape the interactions between states in the security environment in which states or actors in a region find themselves is geography. A geopolitical framework organizes the world into primarily geographic regions based on land proximity. Those of you who have worked in places like the DoD, State Department, etc. know what I'm talking about. Our DoD commands are regional. EUCOM, CENTCOM, AFRICOM, PACOM, and so forth. Our State Department desks and regional bureaus are also divided up in similar regions. You have Middle East, Africa, which is more sub-Saharan Africa, different regions for different portions of Asia, etc. And geopolitical thinkers, theorists, and actors tend to view the world in terms of geography. And so when great powers look at the world through a geopolitical framework, their strategy is based on gaining hegemonic control over a specific geographic region. In other words, a type of geopolitical hegemony, or asserting themselves as a great power or the dominant great power in a specific region. And sometimes even smaller powers can also look at the world through this similarly geographic framework. I'll give you a couple of examples of this geopolitical approach that are playing themselves out right now. We are told on a pretty regular basis that we are returning to an age of great power competition. What we see is that most of the great powers that we're talking about have a geopolitical framework. Putin's Russia has been heavily influenced by a theory called Eurasianism, which is essentially the idea that there should be a sort of hegemonic power that brings together all the different elements of the Eurasian landmass. And Eurasianist philosophy and ideology runs very deep in Russian circles, has had an influence both on Putin and on those close to him, and has actually been something of an ideological export from post-Soviet Russia, particularly under Vladimir Putin. The European Union thinks about its integration in primarily regional terms. Right? So the EU is integrating with neighboring countries. Since 2009, Turkey has also pursued more of a geopolitical strategy, although it's a geopolitical strategy which has a more ideological component to it. Ahmet Davutoglu, who was at one point foreign minister, now prime minister of Turkey, has a view of the Middle East as sort of a triangular region, a region that's defined by concentric triangles of countries, with the great powers in his view, Turkey, Iran, and Egypt, being on the outside of that. And those also are, in his view, the most natural states that exist. Right? So again, there's kind of this idea that geography determines legitimacy as well. So that's a more extreme version of the geopolitical framework. Of course, we could talk here about China with the Belt and Road Initiative. This is an initiative to essentially expand Chinese trade networks and political influence via the old Silk Road and also the Asian Belt as well. So there's a geopolitical vision that China has for that as well. And the last country that I want to mention with this is Israel. Israel has pursued something of a geopolitical strategy in the sense that they have what they call the periphery strategy. Recognizing that they're not going to find a lot of friends and allies in the Middle East, Israel traditionally has looked for countries that are on the periphery or the edge of the Middle Eastern region and has tried to make alliances with them and trade agreements and so forth with them. So that is, to a certain extent, a geographic strategy. It's also pragmatically determined by the security environment and the neighborhood that Israel finds itself in. So those are examples of geopolitical strategies. Another one that I could use is from American history. One of the first, most formative documents or doctrines that was promulgated in American history, of course, is the Monroe Doctrine, which is at least a foundation for making a claim of U.S. hegemony over the Western Hemisphere. So geopolitics has a long, venerable tradition, and it tends to be the framework, I think, that we think about politics, international relations, and subsequently security through. But there is another view that is sometimes complementary to and directly related to this geopolitical view. And that is the view of network-centric security, or network-centric international relations. If we are looking at networks, then the most important thing that we're looking at is not necessarily geographic proximity, but rather on trade. And trade comes in a number of different forms. But where is trade coming from? Where is it going to? Where are the strategic nexes in a trade network? And what are the sort of drivers of that trade? And people looking at things from a more network-centric view are going to see trade and this interplay that we roughly define as trade as being the driver of international politics, and hence of security. Trade routes do not just involve the traditional, we need to move X number of barrels of oil from point Y to point Z. So when I'm talking about trade here, I'm looking at trade in a more holistic sense, defined by what I would describe as four great movements. Movements of four separate things: goods, capital, people, and ideas. Goods, moving of stuff from point A to point B. Capital, where is money flowing? How is money flowing? To whom, from whom? People. Are there diaspora networks and other forms of migration networks that have an impact on international politics and international security? Ideas. This is a big one. I think this is one that's often underestimated. The importance of the flow of ideas can have a huge impact, not only on the region that we're talking about, but also on adjacent region. So are there countries that have historically or are at present pursuing more of a network-centric approach? I would say that if you're thinking about great power politics from a network-centric position, great powers that are network-centric try to preserve their ability to protect their most important trade routes. So the routes that are the most important for movement of goods, people, and ideas to the prosperity of that great power are going to be the areas where that great power is the most invested. The degree to which one or more powers can act to preserve or expand these trade routes, then, determines the effectiveness of their security strategy. So the difference is not so much about controlling the land periphery, about being the dominant power in the land periphery, but rather about ensuring the security of the routes through which you are either sending or receiving your most important goods, capital, people, ideas. Examples of this, I think one that should come to mind right away is, of course, the United States. Much of our strategy is implicitly based on this trade network approach. And that is something that goes back very far in American history. If you look at the time of the founding, if you look at sort of the foreign policy vision that you get from Alexander Hamilton and John Jay, and so I would say by extension, to a certain extent, it's a Washingtonian view. This is something that's seen as very important, the protection of American trade, American commerce, and routes to the same. Jefferson, for all his differences with them, picks up on this in terms of his strategy against the Barbary pirates. When the US becomes involved in the Boxer Rebellion, one of the most important things for the United States is preserving what they call the open door policy. In other words, they don't want anyone to have specific control over concessions in China. They want everyone to have access to China from a trade perspective, including, of course, the United States. And if you look at the colonial strategy that the US pursues as compared with other colonizing powers, the US is very concerned about small, strategic locations, particularly island locations, that can be suitable for Navy bases that can sort of monitor maritime areas. Right? So the US has implicitly operated as a network-centric power. Other than the US, I would say most network-centric powers have a couple things in common. A dependence on the ocean or oceanic commerce, small land area, or land area in which there are larger powers that are in their sort of immediate hinterland, and a tendency toward either mixed or Republican forms of governance. There's something that seems to be either Republican or semi-Republican governments tend to pursue this type of strategy. So historical examples that came to mind were Venice in its heyday during what was called sort of the Venetian Empire, the Hanseatic League, and of course, probably the most famous example of this, the British Empire. One thing that is interesting as we're thinking about networks in general, although I'm not sure what its applicability will be for the Red Sea, is as Brexit is becoming a reality and Britain is reevaluating its place in the world, is this something that the British consider going toward again? Are they going to start looking at a network-centric model of trade, integration, and security? And what will that look like? I think it's an interesting question. It's something that is worth pondering as we look at sort of the future of Britain. Other contemporary examples we could look at, for example, the Gulf states, who are very important when we're talking about Red Sea security. They're a little bit peripheral to the Red Sea itself, but they are major, major players. Singapore, to an extent, also Iran and China. Iran is kind of pursuing both strategies at once. China is, to a certain extent, pursuing both strategies at once. So, what does this look like from a physical perspective? Well, I did title this Remapping the Red Sea, so I think it would be only appropriate if we show you some maps. So let's start with the old map. First slide. You see here the Red Sea divided up between the regions that, from a geopolitical standpoint, institutional standpoint, we've divided into. The first thing that should jump out at you, assuming that I have given my graduate assistant the correct directions and for making the map. Don't blame her, blame the blind guy if it didn't work. But what you should see is a distinction between the two parts of the Red Sea. You should see a sharp division between the Middle East and Africa. That is because from a geopolitical perspective, those two regions divide the Red Sea. And so if you're thinking about things in this geopolitical framework, you're going to see the Red Sea not as one whole region, but as a region in which some parts of it are in the Middle East, some parts of it are in Africa. And that division will be reflected not only institutionally, but also in your security strategy. So institutions drive, and this kind of goes back to some things that Matt and I were talking about. I think I may have said the word I'm an institutions guy like 6 or 7 times in the car. And I'm going to say it again now. I'm an institutions guy. And one of the points of that is that your idea, and one of my sort of operating assumptions I look at stuff like this, is that your ideas shape your institutions, and your institutions will shape your actions and your strategy. Okay? So the idea of regionalism, of regional geopolitics, shapes American institutions, shapes the way the State Department, DoD, etc. Map the world, and that's going to shape your actions. So your security strategy may not be fully looking at this region as an integrated whole. You'll see the Horn of Africa as part of the Sub-Saharan Africa, or Africa Desk area of responsibility. It's part of AFRICOM. The base in Djibouti that the US has is part of the AFRICOM AOR. And you will see that the Middle East stuff, so Yemen, right across the strait, is in CENTCOM. Okay, so you have two different commands, two different institutional apparatuses in DoD that are handling things right across the strait. So to what extent is there going to be interagency or sort of inter-command cooperation? My experience, having worked in government a little bit, having worked specifically at an institute at National Defense University that was designed to foster interagency collaboration. And some of you who have been in government might have comments or thoughts on this as well. My experience is that interagency, inter-command, cross-institutional collaboration will happen to the degree to which it is mandated to happen. And it will happen in such a way as everyone will say, yes, institutional collaboration is great, and here's why what we're doing is the most important and we need most money. Not hearing a lot of dissent from the audience. So there's a danger of institutional stovepiping as we look at this geopolitical approach. So first of all, you already have the institutional challenges of state, AID, U.S. Agency for International Development, DoD, Department of Defense, all these different groups having a hard time talking to each other to begin with. But then when you have these different regional architectures, if the state person who's focused on Africa needs to talk to the DoD person who's focused on Yemen, and that could happen in the Red Sea region, that's going to be a very complicated process for them. So different commands, we have different desks, we have a bit of a geopolitical divide. So you have a lack of institutional regional coherence. You're also going to have conflicting paradigms. So for example, if I'm sitting in the State Department Africa desk, I may have different imperatives or different thoughts about what's most important for regional security than somebody sitting in the State Department's Middle East desk. Because I'm trying to look at my region as a whole and come up with a grand strategy for the region as a whole. So those paradigms are then going to influence what happens at the desk officer level, and so you may have different paradigms, different funding streams, and different approaches to the region. So, not replacing but supplementing some of that geopolitical framework, what are some other maps that might be helpful in looking at the Red Sea region? Now, as I put these maps together, I want to say that I include the Persian Gulf in the Red Sea region. Although, obviously, the Persian Gulf is separate. I do that for a couple of reasons, and some of this will become evident as we look at the maps. First, because the Gulf states are inexplicably linked with the Red Sea right now because of security issues. You have Gulf competition is essentially shaping the context in Yemen. A good bit of the Gulf's trade goes through the Red Sea and the Straits of Bab el-Mandeb, which Admiral Malcolm mentioned initially. You also have foreign direct investment from the Gulf going into Red Sea countries, and to a certain extent, immigration coming from Red Sea countries. And also, I would say the Red Sea is part of a much broader trade network that has ties to the Persian Gulf. So some of these maps are going to show the Persian Gulf as well as the Red Sea as we get into the specifics of this. So how can we remap the region? What I'm going to do here is show you some sample maps. This isn't a full network map, but this is a map that shows some of the sample network ties that we might look at if we were to remap a region from a network-centric perspective. The first map is a sample map looking at goods, and this is a question of where do countries in this region send goods? From where do they receive goods? And what trade relationships are most significant in terms of goods? So my sample map here is actually one that's focused on the Persian Gulf, and this is the top 5 countries to which the Gulf states are exporting their oil. Oil slide? Okay. All right, we've got 6, excellent. And so you'll see a very diverse network of countries listed there. And so some of those trade routes are going to involve the Red Sea, some will not. But things that are coming from the Red Sea, for example, if the Red Sea is a high haven for piracy, if you've got For example, pirates from Somalia that are trying to hijack oil tankers, which we know has happened and probably will happen again. Those are things that are going to impact all of these countries. If you're trying to get oil from the Gulf, then you're a stakeholder in Red Sea security. That's our first map. The next question you would ask would be about financial networks. Where do countries send their capital? From where do they receive foreign direct investment? What are the most significant countries with financial interests in these countries? So for this one, I looked at FDI coming into the Horn of Africa. So foreign direct investment in countries in the Horn of Africa region. And again, we see a fairly diverse map on that as well. And you'll see sometimes different countries will have different networks and very different ties. As we get into some of these next ones, you'll see some more maps that are a little more similar. And if we need to go back to any of these maps and you want to look at them again, let me know. We may also, if folks are interested, be able to distribute some of them. And as I said, these are just samples. They're not full network maps. Now, there are two things I want to do as we talk about diasporas. The first is permanent, what I would call permanent diasporas. Where do immigrants go from these countries, and where do they eventually settle? What impact does this diaspora have on the politics of both the sending country and the receiving country? So this first map focuses on Israel. We have the Israel map up? Okay, great. So there's two groups that I really want to highlight here. One from within the region and one from without. Israel, of course, is a player in Red Sea security, but you'll see a link between Israel and Ethiopia there. I'm not sure how familiar anybody is with this, but in the 1990s, there is a mass migration of Ethiopian Jews to Israel. They make up something close to 1.5 to 2%, if you think of the Israeli population now. And they have actually an impact on Israeli politics. I don't know how closely and granularly everybody's been following the Israeli election, but recently, an Ethiopian Israeli member of the Knesset flipped from one party to another, and this potentially changed the balance of power as they head into the election. And it was an attempt by Likud, which is the party that gained this MK, to court the Ethiopian vote. So to what extent does this diaspora, will this diaspora have an impact on Israel's relationship with Ethiopia? Particularly insofar as, right now this is a diaspora that's not as wealthy, that could change. As people settle in, as people move up economically, that is a pretty significant impact. The other one, of course, is Russia. Okay, so you should see a link there also to Russia and the impact of mass migration, also in the 90s, of Russian Jews to Israel. The impact of the Russian Jews on Israeli politics is profound. Israel Beitenu, which is one of the more influential kingmaker-type parties in Israeli politics right now, is founded by and for Russian Jews. They have a very different conception of the state than some others, and there has been an increasing rapprochement between the Russians, to a certain degree, and Israel under Netanyahu. Right? So there's a tie there, a potential tie there, and there could be an impact from the diaspora that diaspora might have. The second one, and this is more specific to the Gulf, but I think has impact on the Red Sea region as well, as you start looking at remittances. Large guest worker populations in the Gulf send remittances home to their home country. And so these temporary migrants to these countries, because they are always on temporary contracts, come in large numbers, and they send money home in large numbers. And this gives those countries a revenue stake and an interest in security in that region. Okay, so if we look at this map, you're going to see some countries that appear multiple times on multiple lists for different Gulf countries. Note India. India is either at or near the top in all of them. Note Pakistan, Indonesia, the Philippines, Bangladesh. I told one of our attendees that Bangladesh was going to come up on the map again. There it is. Egypt, okay, another Red Sea country. Why is this important for the Red Sea? Because again, insofar as there's instability and insecurity in that Red Sea region, it can have an impact on these trade networks, on networks of people coming into the region. And so these countries then become stakeholders in the broader regional security environment. And the last one is what I would call ideational networks, or ideas, the flow of ideas. So where do ideas that influence the religion and politics of countries come from? Where do these countries, if they're sending out ideas, send them to? To what extent are transnational ideas or transnational ideologies influencing countries in a given region? And what, if any, networks facilitate or are important in that movement of ideas? Obviously, the sample map here is focused on the Hajj. And I think this is probably, if we're looking at the politics of the Muslim world as a whole, sort of Islamic politics, it's a factor that is sometimes underappreciated, just how important the Hajj is from the perspective of disseminating ideas. So the Hajj is understood as something that is a pillar of Islam, as something that everybody does. What is not always understood is that in countries that are not right next to Saudi Arabia, they're not as central to the Middle East, this is something that can have a very significant impact. Ideas that come from Mecca are seen as having a certain kind of primacy. Historical example. Used to be, a couple centuries ago, that if you were making a pilgrimage to the Hajj, and you were going to stay at a hostel along the way, because you got to have some place to stay, it's a long trip, most of the hostels are run by Sufi brotherhoods. Not coincidentally, we see a global expansion of Sufism around the world, particularly concentrated in countries with high numbers of Hajis, people who make the Hajj. Once the Wahhabi-oriented House of Saud gains control of Mecca, first in the 1800s, later permanently in the 1920s, we see an explosion of the export of Wahhabism around the world, particularly concentrated in countries with high levels of Hajj. So if we look at our top 5 countries, note, only one of them is in the Middle East, and that country is in the Red Sea region, that's Egypt. The others are Indonesia, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh. Okay, should look familiar. As you go a little bit further down, you'll see Iran, you'll see some countries in Africa, you'll see other Middle Eastern countries. But I would say, in terms of the Hajj as a whole, we were looking up numbers on this, and a majority of pilgrims, I think it was 57 or 58%, something along those lines, actually come from non-Middle Eastern Asian countries. That's a staggering number. And that means that what's happening in the Gulf, and by extension in the Red Sea, has huge security implications for those countries, because ideas are coming back from them. So what happens if we put all of these things together, and we remap the Red Sea with all of these different sample maps? And this is very incomplete. Final slide. This is far from a complete network map, but I think it gives us a broader sense of the security implications of a network-centric approach. So there are a lot of stakeholders that are listed here that are not geographic neighbors by any means, but they have an impact, both in terms of they have an interest in preserving the security of the region, and they have an impact on the security of the region as they are bringing in goods, people, ideas, and capital to the region. So what are some implications of this new map? First of all, I would say we need to rethink who is and who is not a security stakeholder in the region. When looking at a network analysis, stakeholders from outside of the geographic region can have a profound connection to regional security. Some of the top countries that are non-regional security stakeholders might be located in places like South Asia, India, Pakistan. Would certainly probably include China and Indonesia, or in East and Southeast Asia. And of course, the United States. We are certainly coming in from a network perspective. We are not in the region, but as Admiral Balcom mentioned at the outset, the Red Sea is very important for our trade. It is a trade choke point, and if you look at the network, if you were to look at the network of the U.S. movement of goods, people, ideas, and capital, a lot of it's going to go through that choke point that defines the Red Sea region. So even we are a stakeholder because of this network-centric approach. Should this lead us to rethink security institutions. So one of the things in the Great Decisions chapter I thought was really interesting is they recommend a Red Sea security special envoy. I thought that was an excellent recommendation. But it may be worth going a little bit further, I would say, in terms of the integration of perspectives within and across security agencies and stakeholders in the U.S. Might not be a good idea, or it might be a good idea to have sort of a permanent institutionalized structure where all these different stakeholders can come together. And of course, that has the challenges mentioned previously, mentioned above. Even if there's a mandate, actors may not see that as the most important, but once you create an institutional space for it, then that institutional space starts asserting its own interests, and I think there's a possibility that could well balance some of the natural tendencies. Government institutions are likely to retain their current regional divisions for quite some time. I don't expect a massive, major realignment in State Department, in DoD, anything like that. And there are some very good logical reasons why they should. So it's kind of working around and through the current regionalized institutional framework will be a constant challenge, but it's a necessity, and I think it can be done to bring in some more of this network approach and just get people in these desks to realize that there are interconnections with people that they probably never would have even considered if they're putting together an interagency policy committee or IPC meeting. And probably most of them would never think, hey, we need to think about bringing people from the South Asia desk. We need to think about talking to the China or Indonesia desk office and bringing them in to see if they have any insights on this. There are also some unique challenges that I think are thrown into high relief as we look at more of a network of security. High network environments are highly desirable for rogue actors for a number of reasons. So if you were to look at a region that did not have as many of these branching off networks, you probably would see less security focus, perhaps. But insofar as a lot of key trade routes run through an area, rogue actors are going to try to exploit those more. And just sort of makes sense. The other thing is that networks that are very efficient at moving goods, money, people, and ideas can also be used to move illicit goods, dirty money, people desiring to do harm, or also victims of forced trafficking, and dangerous or destabilizing ideas. So saying that networks move these things doesn't always necessarily mean the things that goods, people, ideas, or money that are being moved in an illicit way and in a way that actually promotes trade and security and so forth. So those are some unique challenges I think that the more network focused approach brings into high relief. And in terms of limits, number one is, as I emphasized earlier, geographic proximity still matters. So we don't want to say geopolitics doesn't matter, that it's not important about proximity, all we need to focus on is networks. Certain threats are going to be intensified because of geographic proximity. Classic example of this, why are the Saudis and the Iranians very, very involved in Yemen in a way that they are perhaps not involved in countries that are more geographically distant. They are involved, but not to the same extent, geographic proximity. So geographic proximity is not irrelevant, and we certainly don't want to completely eliminate that geopolitical framework. So geopolitics still ultimately matters because proximity matters. The other thing that I think sometimes when people are talking about this network-centric approach, where folks can go too far, is talking about sort of the withering away or the disappearance of the state, as if the state is not still the or a central actor. And states also, I would say, still matter. In fact, even if you look at the map that we have, that I put together here, it's very state-centric, right? It has a bit of a state bias. And that is because in terms of monopoly force, in terms of looking at security policy and strategies, and in terms of engaging with key actors, the states are still really important. So we should not emphasize networks to the extent that we de-emphasize states. I think a third challenge, and this is less theoretical and more practical, is that despite being stakeholders, some regional stakeholders, or non-regional stakeholders, may not actually recognize the degree to which these security issues are important to them, or they may not maximize their interests. And this is particularly true if the networks that we're talking about don't run directly through the state. So the example that jumps out at me here is the remittance issue. If you are not seeing most of this remittance come through actually government pathways, if it's coming family to family, people sending money back through their families, you may not see the extent to which these issues are important and issues in this region are important. Oftentimes governments have a bias against really looking into religious ideas. The state doesn't always get religion 100%, so people may undervalue the importance of the Hajj. So there are some ways in which that the fact that our regional stakeholders is something that non-regional countries may not realize. The other problem is that you may have some countries that are going to free ride. They may realize the importance of the regional security, but there can often be an attitude of, well, the U.S. is the hegemon, the U.S. has got this. And sometimes it would be beneficial for the U.S. if some of these other countries would play a more assertive role in assisting with that. On the other hand, you will probably have some countries that want to destabilize the region for their own ends. We could think prominently of countries like Iran that have had an interest in using instability and insecurity in this region to sort of change the balance of power. So on the whole, I would say a more network approach, remapping the region in a network sense, helps with some of the particularities of, helps fill in some of the gaps. But a network-centric approach is not going to replace geopolitics. I think it's a good supplemental. And I think if we hold those two maps in combination, in tension, we'll start to see the full web of stakeholders, of nations, and of interests that come into play in a regional security framework. And so that's all I have for the theoretical side. Thank you very much. And we'll have time here in a few minutes for some questions.
So, sir, it was a very interesting presentation. I've been out in the area a lot. But my question is that the thesis on transfer of ideas, why did you just focus on the Hajj versus transfer of ideas from other areas or outside? Why just the Hajj?
A couple of reasons. One, so all of these things that I'm presenting here are sort of a sample. Mapping out the full sort of network on each of these would probably not only take a long time, but you would want people who have really specific country expertise. The reason I picked the Hajj is because of the size and scope of the transfer of ideas from the region that comes from that. But there are others. You could look at, for example, ideas about democratization. You could look at ideas about capitalism, for example. A lot of people talk about two different models of capitalism that exist, the American and the Chinese. And so are there degrees to which, in some of these developing countries, they're pulling from one idea or another? Partially, I would say also it's because for me, I'm a religion and politics guy by background, and so that's a big one. But of course, not all ideas are connected with religion. You can even look at sort of ideas of ethnicity, or even ideas of regionalism, for example. So this was a sample, but it's by no means meant to be exhaustive. Yes?
Given that the dominant form of Islam in Saudi Arabia is Wahhabi, and you indicated that Wahhabi ideas are being spread, could this, to some degree, account for the move away from moderate Islam towards a more extreme version, if I might say, in Indonesia that we've seen in the last few years?
I love it when people ask me questions about my case study for my dissertation. The short answer is yes. The longer answer is this. Indonesia's always been, like for centuries has been, one of the largest sending countries for pilgrims to the Hajj. In fact, the Jawi pilgrims, Jawi was the term they used for pilgrims from Java, were the largest non-Arab group for centuries. There are some scholars who would argue that, in fact, insofar as there is a pre-national idea of Indonesia, it is formed by pilgrims from different parts of Indonesia coming together. Oh, you're from Java. I'm from, Sulawesi, or I'm from, different parts of Sumatra, what's now Aceh, and so forth. And forming these sort of networks. So what you see with Indonesian Islam is that when the pilgrims from Indonesia first start coming, as I mentioned in my talk, a lot of the people that are there, that are running the hostels for pilgrims, that are sort of the folks they're interacting with on trade routes, and even the scholars in Mecca are influenced by Sufism. They're influenced by the thought of a Sufi thinker called Al-Ghazali, who is more of a political quietist. He thinks Sharia is important, but he focuses it through this traditional Sufi desire to have a direct mystical experience with the divine. And so that idea goes back to Indonesia. And that idea meshes very, very well with pre-existing Indonesian ideas of sacred power and sacred authority. In most societies, power and authority is something that comes from the sacred. And so the Indonesians really kind of glom onto this and say, oh, okay, yeah, this makes sense to us. Sufism makes sense as sort of a form of sacred power and authority. Beginning in 1800, you have a brief period in which Ibn Abdul Wahhab's followers gain control of Mecca. And so you get the first wave of people that are coming back from Indonesia, from the Hajj, or to Indonesia from the Hajj, that are saying, wait a minute, these local practices aren't the teachings that we just heard from Mecca. And Mecca has always had a specific place in the geo-ideational landscape of Indonesia. That's a term that I didn't just make up, but I think I made it up for another paper that I wrote. And what I mean by that is the ideas that you use to map the world, right? So for Indonesia, even though Mecca is really far away, it has a central role because there's this idea in Indonesian culture of you go on a pilgrimage to a place and you return from that pilgrimage with a certain form of spiritual power that predates Islam. So there's always been a certain amount of deference to the teachings that are coming out of Mecca. So if you map it out and you look at the waves of increasingly what I would say is non-localized Islam in Indonesia, they are often coming from Mecca. What is interesting in Indonesia is the degree to which the local forces, the guys that are localized in Indonesia, have actually organized and pushed back against that. So Nahdlatul Ulama, which is the largest Muslim organization in the world, is based out of Indonesia. They are really focused on, we want to preserve the classical Indonesian version of Islam that we've had for centuries. And there's a lot of opposition to the forms that are coming in from the Middle East. That is something that I think bears watching. Because what you may see, because Sufis traditionally have this greater degree of organization, what I'm interested to see is, are we going to see an actual transnational network of local Islam, where the different local groups are coming together, seeing the same threat, and sort of comparing notes and comparing strategies on how to respond to it. So that's another network that I'm interested in watching to see if it develops.
I wonder if you'd consider a revision to the idea that there should be a special envoy for the Red Sea. And the reason I say that is it seems to be based on the idea that there is such severe stovepiping in the State Department that the ability of one organization, NEA for example, to talk to AF is virtually impossible. And I think that really is not the best perception of it. They're actually, the State Department is not DoD. It's a much smaller, and it's also a much less formal organization. For example, most of the desk officers that you talk about, and more importantly, the directors for the areas, only sit, say, 50, 60 yards from each other.
Right.
They've served repeatedly with each other. And if they have questions about a particular area or a particular concept that's come up, they pick up the phone and talk to each other. Also, when there is a question about a larger cross-regional issue, there's common meetings that are held in the department, and the biggest problem is to keep people out of the meetings. And ultimately, the way to affect that integration, if it's necessary, and it's not happening in any other way, is the Undersecretary for Political Affairs, who's currently David Hale, and he simply calls people up and brings them in and they talk it out. So one of the problems of the department, and I don't need to go on, is that when new political appointees come in, they'll do exactly what you're proposing. They put a bunch of people in as special envoys for this, that, and something else, which actually clogs the system, because now you have a new person and a new bureaucracy can get set up, which doesn't permit the normal information flow. So I guess, I'm sorry to go on, but
No.
the question is, would you be considerate of like all that?
I mean, I'm as I said at the outset, this is, guinea pigging some ideas. What I would say is, in terms of, the chapter mentioned a special envoy. My thought is more something institutionally that has the power to convene actors both across desks, but also across agencies. Because one of the difficulties when, in terms of stovepiping, is not just within the agency, but also interagency. So I could see a situation in which you've got a security issue in Somalia or Yemen that is causing a refugee crisis across the street, right? So you've got, state AID are working the humanitarian side on one side of the street, but they're like, look, really, to solve this problem, we need to interact with what's happening on the security side, which means we need to talk to DoD on the other side of the street. And so having some sort of lean, which I know is always a dangerous thing to say in government because it's hard to keep it that way, but some sort of lean institution that's capable of both, where there are internal institutional stovepipes working across that, but also where there are interagency collaboration issues, which I think all of us know is a challenge. They could work around that. So if that's not, institutionally speaking, if the special envoy that sits in state is not the most effective way to do that, then maybe it's some sort of other institutional structure that sits somewhere else that has the power to coordinate. Maybe it sits in the National Security Council.
That's what it's for.
Yeah, that can do that. Maybe you have a specific Red Sea desk at National Security Council that coordinates an interagency and all of that. So my concern is less about where the person sits and what we call them, but more do they have the ability to coordinate those institutional factors.
The one thing is, and I only have the experience of that, so I don't know anything about the State Department. I mean, I know something about them, I don't know how they operate. But the concept you're talking about, the biggest obstacle I see is funding lines. And the funding lines that you have, this person has a desk, and he has to protect his rice bowl. And if you were to get that out of the way, and it's all personality driven, like this gentleman said. If the boss says, if we're going to have a meeting, then it's very difficult. I can see unless you got somebody that really doesn't care about money, doesn't care about who gets what, no credit, that's the only way it's going to work.
Right. And the problem is if they don't care about money, then they probably don't have it.
Yeah.
So when I used to teach comparative politics, I sort of half jokingly, but only half, told my students that I had a law that I called Nolte's iron law of bureaucracy. And that is that when any given bureaucracy is given a specific institutional mission, there will be two imperatives. Number one, preserve the institution. Number two, and secondary to number one, accomplish the mission. And number two should never be allowed to interfere with number one. And so I think that definitely is one of the huge problems of any of this kind of interagency collaboration, because if it's tied to funding streams, then if you say, hey, we've solved this problem, or hey, we're going to collaborate with these other people, they'll say, great, that means that you need less money. No, that's not what that means. So how do we get around that in sort of a permanent way? I think every bureaucratic institution, be it at the government level, be it possibly even at the university level, be it at the business level, is going to have these types of challenges. And I think probably the only way to do it is to either create such a strong imperative that somebody who doesn't have a monetary interest can convene these people. The problem with that is when that person's gone, so is the ability to convene. Or you create something institutionally that has a specific mission and mandate to coordinate between these different agencies. Then you have the problem of course, everybody's competing for funding. So I don't know that there is a perfect solution to that, but it is definitely an institutional challenge that would need to be worked through for any kind of interagency.
Well, one thing is, they try to do it with the Department of Homeland Security.
Yeah.
And there was a specific mantra there, everybody together. And, what has it been, 20 years since 9/11? And I think they're getting there.
Right.
But that's another model that, to your thesis, if you had that, maybe it would work. It took 20 years. I don't even know if it's working out.
Europe, or what's left of the EU, as being a dominant player. So how is Russia going to attempt to gobble up some of the EU, or China, or the trade packages, or that type of influence on Europe, to which we have a common bond?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. So I can talk generally about that, and then I can talk in a more specific regional focus. So as a general rule, I think Russia is skeptical of any kind of European integration that they're not in charge of. And so, you know, I think the reasons for Britain being skeptical of the European Union are different than the reasons that the Russians have. The Europeans have always had sort of an ambivalent relationship. One of my favorite commentaries on actually Britain and the EU comes from a very scholarly academic source. It's called Yes Minister, which for those who don't know is a Britcom. And there's an episode, I think from the 70s, where one of the permanent civil servants is talking to Jim Hacker, who's the minister, about the reason we joined the EU was to keep the whole thing from working. And so, you know, there's something very British about that. But I think for Russia, you know, they're concerned that EU integration might limit their freedom of action. I think they're probably unduly concerned about that, to be honest, but because it seems like that is not something the EU has been super interested in doing on a consistent basis. In terms of China, I don't think China has an interest in, you know, any kind of interest in undermining the EU specifically. It just wants to sort of compete for resources and expand its economic footprint. I look at China as, in terms of security, as more likely to be a free rider than a destabilizer in a lot of these regions. In other words, they're happy to benefit from us doing the security things for them, especially in the Middle East, particularly if they can benefit from that financially. Which will, I think, if I'm right about that, and I'm fairly certain I am, that has interesting implications for the whole U.S.-China competition, because China is competing with the U.S. strategically, not on a global scale. And that's probably a whole different lecture and a whole different topic. In terms of the Red Sea, I think the key actor in terms of looking at the EU role is France, and particularly the French relationship with Djibouti, and with some of the other actors in the region where the French have long-standing ties. The French have a complicated relationship with colonialism and post-colonialism, particularly if you have studied or are focused on Africa. You probably are well aware of the degree to which France is quietly but significantly more involved than you would expect in their former colonies, given the things the French say about us being involved. So that, I think, for them is an area of interest and a focus. They're going to be interested in the trade component. Obviously, you'll see some EU countries or EU-adjacent countries that are on some of those lists, particularly the oil list. So they've got an interest there. Britain is interesting because Britain, again, has historic ties. And part of me wonders if they're going to try to follow a Commonwealth strategy, which would be more of a network-based approach where they try to do free trade pacts with some of the Commonwealth countries. Some folks on the Tory and Eurosceptic right have talked about this. I'm not sure that some of the other folks in the Eurosceptic camp who are really sort of in it because they don't like the ways of immigration really understand the degree to which some of their co-Brexiteers are interested in Britain playing a role in the Commonwealth and what that means. So that'll be interesting to watch as we move forward. You know, and of course we have the Britain-China Huawei thing, which doesn't have any specific implications for the Red Sea, but insofar as the U.S. is interested in countering China's 5G dominance, and insofar as some of these countries in the Red Sea might be players in that, I think Britain's decision certainly complicates that goal for the United States. Yes?
When you were initially defining the Red Sea,
Can you speak up a little bit, Phil?
Speak up, Bill.
but you did not mention the Suez Canal. Given the fact that we're enlarging, continually enlarging the shipping, the ships themselves, tankers and container ships, that obviously is having an impact on what can move through the Suez. I wonder if you could amplify.
I definitely think that is a continuing vital issue in terms of the importance of the Suez Canal. If we get to the point where there have to be, construction changes to the Suez Canal, then all of a sudden, some of the issues that are happening in Egypt, particularly some of the past security issues, possibility of instability, threats of domestic terrorism, and so forth, are going to be magnified because that's the kind of thing it's going to bring in. And if that happens, so if we get to a position where somebody says we need to widen it or make changes to Suez, which I think is the implication of your question, is that correct? Yeah. Okay, so if we get to that position, things that come into mind that will immediately happen. Number one, all of a sudden Egypt is going to have guest workers coming in. Because to a certain extent you're going to have native Egyptian labor doing that, which will then affect the guest workers in the Gulf, right? So that affects the balance for them. But also you're going to have people coming from other parts of Africa, other parts of the Middle East, possibly even workers from South and Southeast Asia into that environment to work. Number two, almost certainly some of the groups that are very unhappy with the current government, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi and everything that's happened since the Arab Spring, are going to take that as an opportunity to try to make that displeasure felt, possibly up to and including terrorism. So the security on that will be a challenge. If we get to that point where this is something that is talking about, Egypt becomes a much more important security issue immediately. And I would not be terribly surprised if, given the possible economic benefits that will come to Egypt of being able to increase their shipping and also increase jobs and just general economic investment, if that's something that we hear the Egyptians talking about wanting to do, assuming they can find investors. The other thing to watch there is who's going to invest in the project. The degree to which China is interested in investing in strategic choke points, particularly if they can own some of the components of it. Then you also have, think about the Emiratis and the Saudis who've been very interested in investing in port facilities and things like that. Particularly some of those countries that are thinking, okay, oil's going to run out in X decades, we need to start diversifying. That's a way for them to diversify. They have a lot of investment capital. So there are, and then of course, the Israelis, right? Do the Israelis, since they have a relationship with the Egyptian government, want to put some money in, have some interest? So I think I think you're asking a very interesting question of something that could happen that would probably have enough interesting security challenges to fuel several dissertation projects, a couple of novels in the Tom Clancy franchise, and endless headaches for the National Security Council of the United States.
You've described a very dynamic network. And I'm wondering how, given that approach, the network-centric analysis that you present, how would you evaluate the totality of it? Is this network stable? Is it robust? Is it fragile? Where are the biggest challenges, let's say, over the next 3 to 5 years, to keep that network going? Should it be kept going? Can it be improved? Who benefits? Who loses? Those are the kinds of questions that I'd like to briefly address.
I can tell Dr. Karp directs a lot of dissertations. No, that's an excellent question. So is the network so first of all, I think the first thing, and this may be a little bit confusing because I described it as a sample network map, but actually looking at sort of overlapping and sometimes concentric networks. So if you're asking me, is the sort of network that we're looking at here stable, fragile, or robust, I would have to say yes. Because parts, and let me break that down a little bit. I think the Hajj network is actually fairly stable and robust. Those countries have been sending people to Mecca and receiving people back for centuries. That's probably not going to change. So that's a network that is stable. If you're talking about how it can be improved, that sort of depends on your thoughts about the ideas that are coming out and going in. And also, do some of the folks in Saudi Arabia start looking at the impact of that and say, maybe we want to think about what's being sent out. And if they try to exert control over that, which I suspect the current leadership in Saudi Arabia probably would want to do that, what impact does that have on them domestically? So I would say it is stable and robust, but actually there's also a certain amount of fragility if somebody tries to change it as well. Some of the other networks, FDI, FDI is going to change if the security environment changes. So there are ways to expand that. If you stabilize the security in some of the specific countries, obviously the investments can go up. And so those are just a couple of examples. How can we improve the networks? Well, actually, no, let me back up to, I think, the really important questions. The biggest challenges over the next 5 years to the stability of these networks. One of the things that concerns me a little bit is the degree to which, because they themselves operate in a network fashion, transnational terrorist groups and criminal organizations will be able to find and exploit network vulnerabilities. Now, for illicit networks, the exploitation is not we want to bring the network down because they want to profit off it. But for example, if you talk about the oil transmission, Al-Qaeda has always had a very complicated relationship with the oil weapon. Sometimes they said it needs to be preserved as an Islamic resource. Sometimes they thought about attacking it. There are a lot of asymmetric ways that you could mess with that. Guest workers, right? So if you started to see collaboration between, let's just say AQAP, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and some of their affiliates, and some of the groups that exist in Pakistan, could they try to smuggle terrorist operators or something like that into one of these countries to cause a terrorist attack through the guest worker program? Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that the Gulf countries are very concerned about that, but that would be a network vulnerability that that would be concerned about. If you can get somebody, if they can get people in those networks in very specific cogs, there's a lot of damage that could be done there. And so those are the things that concern me is terrorist groups and other operators that are used to operating in an asymmetric fashion, being able to exploit those network vulnerabilities. I think we've seen Iran try to do this a little bit in terms of oil, and I think we're probably going to see more. The symmetrical escalation thing has not worked well for them, I would say, and so if they are going to try to retaliate and look for some outside-the-box ways of doing things, I think they're going to probably look for some more asymmetric ways to exploit some of those network vulnerabilities. What can be done to improve the networks? Number one, I think getting more of an emphasis on how important they are, and us identifying with some of the partners, some of those fragilities, and helping provide security for that. I think also broader international stakeholder involvement and understanding. I think a third thing is sometimes getting governments to recognize the degree to which non-government stuff that's happening is important from a security perspective. How often are the Gulf countries and the South Asian countries having dialogues about things like Hajj and remittances? Probably they should be doing it more, because I think there might be both some challenges that they're not seeing and some opportunities that they're not seeing that would happen if there were more conversations about those two network flows. So I would say those are things that could be done to improve it. But there's always an amount of fragility, because high network, where there's a lot of networks, there's always going to be people that want to try to exploit it.
To the degree that our administration presently doesn't seem to understand the importance of cooperation and networks, how do you think that may diminish our role overall?
I think that's an interesting question in this region, because one of the things that I would say about President Trump that is kind of true of all presidents, but is probably more true of Trump than it is of others. So let me just compare Trump to Bush and Obama in a specific way. I would say for Bush and Obama, there is a coherent ideological core that animates their foreign policy vision of the world. And sometimes that ideology leads them to do things that don't make practical sense in a given situation, and sometimes it leads them to do things that are very insightful, but you kind of know where they're coming from an ideological standpoint. I would say the Trump administration's approach is much more personalistic. By that I mean that Trump's personal relationships with leaders and with key actors are going to influence to a degree that is greater than the two previous administrations, the way he interacts and the way his administration interacts with those countries. What is interesting about that is that, in my opinion, the single person who has been, or country, but really focused on a person too as well, who's been the most effective in capitalizing on that unique aspect of Trump's personality and catering to it is Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia. In terms of Trump's psychology, the first visit that Trump made, and I may have even said this last year because it's still true, but the first visit that he made to Saudi Arabia, the way the Saudis treated him and the way they responded was almost perfectly tailor-made to forge a very strong bond with Trump. They, I think, interpreted his psychology very effectively, very well. The second person, the person who behind Mohammed bin Salman, who has been the most effective at this, is probably Bibi Netanyahu. And so, what do both of those actors have in common? They both have particular interests in the Red Sea. And so I think, insofar as the Trump administration has been focused on that, I would not underestimate the influence of and impact of those particularly strong personal relationships, because that really does seem to be a motivating factor for Trump. You know, and again, just like having the coherent ideological core, there are pluses to that, there are minuses to that.
There is another implication there that I think needs to be emphasized, and it's very colloquial. It's the United States Navy. Because what you're really talking about in that last comment, the relationship and the importance of Israel and Saudi Arabia, the Trump administration, tends to not focus on an army or a land presence. The presence of the U.S. Navy in the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf becomes very, very important. And a real key to that policy shift.
Yes, first comment is that anytime you're talking about a network approach, and anytime you're thinking of a network power, a good portion of their power projection is going to be maritime focused. For the very simple reason that most trade, the most efficient way to pass all of these things is over water. So unsurprisingly, network powers are going to have a strong focus on naval aspects. I think that insofar as the Army does play a role, a lot of the threats that come from the network are more from that insurgency, terrorism type focus. So insofar as both the Army and the Marines have expertise in dealing with counterinsurgency and counterterrorism, there's certainly an important role for them in terms of network security. You know, with the proviso that to a large degree, Navy is going to be doing the power projection stuff because networks, you know, are running across water. I think the other thing is, again, the geopolitical aspect is still very important, and so there definitely needs to be a balance. I know this is a Navy town, but we can't go completely Navy.
Just one brief question. You know, we talk about hard power and soft power and smart power. Is it time to talk about network power? And what would that mean?
Yes, good question. And I would say that network power is, yes, something that we need to talk about. I think it is a combination of the three to a certain extent, but in particular, network power focuses on connections and routes of connection and ways in which you're connected with other people and other groups. And so I think network power is very closely related to soft power. Perhaps network power is maybe a more precise application of a way of talking about soft power. Soft power is, you know, to a certain extent, the projection of cultural power. And I would put culture and other aspects of soft power, non-military power, I put most of those actually in terms of network. So can we disaggregate soft power and network power? I'll be honest and say that's something I probably would have to think about in terms of how separate are those two concepts and how much do they overlap. But I do think at least talking about the degree to which networks influence things, and I would say even more so, the degree to which American power and influence is network dependent, is something that probably should be more emphasized. You know, our hard power advantages are tremendous, but they are to a certain extent areas in which other countries are trying to match us. I don't think there's anybody right now out there who has either the interest or the capacity to match the kind of soft power, network power that the U.S. could project if we were effective about using it.
Anything else? Well, Dr. Nolte, thank you again for not only the comprehensive presentation, but also for helping us understand the importance of this issue, and it's very complex, but also the importance of the network approach to understanding that. And so on behalf of our council, I'd like to, I know last year you were here, you got our rendition of our Pewter Jefferson Cup. Well, this year, I want to give you a crystal version of that.
Oh, wow.
Of the Jefferson Cup. And it has,
I gotta come back next year.
computer one, and now you have a crystal one, but it's etched with a globe, which really signifies your contribution to our understanding of this very, very complex global issue. And with that, there's a small stipend for compensate you for what you did.
I appreciate that. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.